So let's talk about how Games Workshop with all their resources are unable to create a better rules resource than one guy with his Warhammer website. Let's talk about Wahapedia, which seems to be leading the way to such an extent that Games Workshop are even borrowing their ideas. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop and Wahapedia, the site that seems to deliver Warhammer 40k rules basically better than anywhere else, and Games Workshop seem to be utterly powerless to shut down. Let's talk about the problem that Games Workshop arguably creates for themselves, how Wahapedia solves it in style, some of the legal issues which they've had with Games Workshop, and one way that had spotted that it looks like Wahapedia might actually have inspired Games Workshop to make better datasheets. So first up, perhaps one of the main issues that Warhammer 40k has, and Games Workshop in general, is that they just kind of deliver rules very badly. That is an opinion of course, but a pretty commonly held one, and it's particularly highlighted whenever the 40k rules get excessively bloated. It is currently a very broad game, with a ton of rules spread across all manner of different books and supplements. 9th edition codexes have been particularly dense, to the extent where it's almost complained about by the community as a bit of a problem, whereas in the past complaints were very much on the other side of the fence, saying that codexes were a bit thin and didn't really have much crunch to them. For a lot of people who don't have endless amounts of time to devote to Warhammer 40k, even learning your own codex can take a little while, let alone having much hope of understanding the vast array of opposing armies and all of their convoluted interactions. Of course, it's basically impossible to have any chance of this if you don't actually have access to their army books yourself, and you're unlikely to spend a decent amount of money buying an army book for a faction that you don't collect. It's certainly a barrier to entering the game in the first place, never mind of getting a proper grasp of the vast array of Warhammer 40k armies out there. Currently Games Workshop has perhaps two main options for rules delivery: either just get all the copies in paper, codex rulebooks at £32.50 or $55, really quite expensive for fancy paper if the main thing that you're after is actually the mechanical rules to play the army and the pretty pictures aren't perhaps as much of a big interest to you. Codexes I think are fun and do have their appeal, but they really have a whole ton of downsides, kind of cumbersome to carry around. You can't just search them with a quick search function, and they can be a bit of a faff to reference, particularly if you're doing so in addition to the core book, any sort of tournament mission packs, supplemental content, plus the FAQs and supplemental things that you have online like the balanced data slates. You might also have outright errors that need addressing in FAQs, or things that got outdated as soon as the book dropped, as with Leagues of Votan. The other alternative is the Warhammer 40k app. This one you need to pay for in a paid subscription, plus buy the codexes as well if you want the full rules, so arguably even more expensive. And while it does have a few advantages, such as a handy enough quick reference search function, it does have a reputation for a fair amount of errors, and its rules interface maybe isn't the most helpful in the world, often needing to do a lot of scrolling if you've got a unit with a bunch of different weapon profiles. I think the 40k app was basically Games Workshop's attempt to make a unified digital rule set while still holding on to expensive codex sales, but it definitely has its drawbacks and a lot of people struggle to rely on it. If you give a community those kind of problems, then some people are going to try and take matters into their own hands, and that's basically how Wahapedia started. One guy made his own website for it, a browser-based compendium of Warhammer 40k rules, kept up to date with FAQ changes, and an impressively fine-tooth comb for fixing errors. The site comes up in Google search if you just search the names for a bunch of Warhammer units, never mind if you add rules to it. And at least anecdotally, it does seem to be in very common usage within the player base in Warhammer 40k. Lots of people seem to use it as a quick reference tool. I guess it's very easy to find answers from if you can just Google something rather than having to dig out a codex book that you might or might not own, and reliable enough to the extent where people trust it not to have important errors. On the site there's basically a compendium of the different factions, and if you click into each faction then you can look at datasheets for every single unit there. The datasheets have handy points costs on them, unlike Games Workshop's things, plus you get individual pages for each of the codex rules, the core rules of 40k, and all the various different mission packs if you wanted to reference something from say Warzone Nephilim or something. On top of all that data, it also supports Kill Team and Age of Sigmar, though I believe not Horus Heresy yet, at least to my knowledge. It's just ridiculously impressive that all of this is maintained by a single person. Warhammer 40k does have a crazy amount of rules, and codexes that update really quite a bit. Sometimes things can take a while to get updated to the site, but in general it keeps track of the updates fairly quickly. Apparently maintaining the site has grown to the extent where the guy is giving up his full-time work now, and making the maintenance and expansion of Wahapedia into his full-time job, supported via donations via a site called Boosty. I'll leave a link to that down in the video description if you did want to check it out and give it a look if you're someone who uses Wahapedia regularly. Compared with Games Workshop's rules offerings, though, either their codexes or their app, Wahapedia does kind of go above and beyond. Perhaps is one of the reasons why it's got such a wide usage. I think the fact that the rules are available in just regular internet browsers and on phones are really quite easy. It means that you can access it whenever you've got access to internet, no need for logging into an app or anything like that, or digging out rule books that you may or may not own. The FAQ and the points changes are digitally updated into it. For the most part, Games Workshop do that with their own app as well, but of course that's not something that you get with the codexes. Definitely a big advantage over printed paper, without also having to refer to an FAQ document separately and check individually if there's anything that refers to the rule in question. As mentioned, in general opinion from anecdotes, I've heard very little in terms of errors for Wahapedia. If any are identified, then there's an easy system for getting in touch with the mod team and the chap himself. I think he runs it out of a Discord server, and the way the site works, changes can be made very quickly if it's about. In terms of ranking accuracy with Warhammer 40k rules, I'd probably rank the codexes last, seeing as they go out of date quite so quickly. Then maybe sources like the Warhammer app and Battlescribe. They do have things that fix the errors but maybe take a little bit more time. And then Warhapedia I'd rank first. Again, kind of hilarious being so much ahead of the official sources. Next up, the site is very easy to navigate. You can search pages from Google or within the site. It's possible to use the find function on internet browsers to find words within the big text documents, so you can jump to the exact location of a rule very easily. Plus, a few other clever things are things like the relevant stratagems, warlord traits, and psychic powers linked under each datasheet. Plus, various different keywords can be hovered over and bring up the relevant section of rules, so you don't even necessarily need to navigate away from the same page. More recently, there's a few more in-depth functions added. You can filter for certain chapters for Space Marines, for example, tick or cross Legends rules or Crusade rules for whether or not you want to be seeing those when you're referencing the documents. Overall, I would argue that Wahapedia is just very good as a source, though obviously by its very nature, taking and reprinting the information from Games Workshop's books, it is basically going to come into conflict with Games Workshop's legal team, who do have a reputation for being a little bit zealous in making sure that people don't rip off their stuff, whether it's fan animators, third-party bits manufacturers, or games rule sources. By the site's own admission, they do admit that it basically does breach copyright law or IP to some sort of extent. I'll admit I'm not an expert on that myself, but it seems simple enough to understand that republishing a lot of companies' material that you'd usually have to pay for is going to get you on their bad side. In the past, Games Workshop have sent Wahapedia a cease and desist letter asking them to stop publishing things, and I believe that they also got in touch with Patreon as well to get the site's Patreon page taken down. I guess trying to cut off funding for the chap who is running his site, and I guess monetizing Games Workshop's own rules, even if he does happen to be delivering them in a better way than they could. I guess to an extent, Games Workshop is kind of obliged to try and defend their own intellectual property. If they don't at least try and do so, then at least to my understanding, they'd have a legal case argued against them that if they don't defend things, then it's basically in the public domain. So they wouldn't be able to argue about one site using their rules if they don't argue about everyone doing so. Unfortunately for Games Workshop, and perhaps fortunately for everyone who wants to be able to access their rules pretty easily, Wahapedia was able to escape Games Workshop's legal reach by being based in a country that doesn't really care all that much about copyright infringement laws, meaning that their cease and desist letters aren't really going to get them very far. The site now has a .ru domain name, though I believe that the chap himself was based in one of the other post-Soviet states. I might be wrong on that front though. In any case, he must be doing at least sufficiently well out of it to consider going full-time. Again, I guess that subscription service called Boosty is probably a big part of that. Even if Games Workshop ideally would shut down Wahapedia, I feel like you could certainly make the argument that it's probably good for Games Workshop overall, even if it does mean that they might lose out on a few codex sales or app subscriptions because of it. I certainly suspect that an easy access and high quality rules tool is generally a great thing for making a complex game a lot more accessible to other people that might not have bothered getting into it. I think it's perhaps one thing to try and understand a game if the rules can only be found in books in a shop, and another if a quick Google search can bring up the entire compendium of different rules, and you can have a look through all the myriad options and take a look at what might suit your tastes. Making the overall playing experience of Warhammer 40k at least a fair chunk easier, I'd imagine is something that's going to help keep at least a few people in the hobby out of the vast amount of people that play, so I'm sure it's indirectly responsible for a good chunk of miniature sales. Obviously though, people will have different opinions when it comes to Games Workshop and legal stuff. As mentioned, I do think that it's really quite widely used in the community, though there will be plenty of people out there that just don't want to countenance using something unofficial and technically illegal, even as a quick reference tool to a game that you might have spent many hundreds of pounds or dollars on. Finally though, and certainly one of the things that made me inspired to make this video covering Wahapedia, is that I did notice one little detail out of Games Workshop's new leaked datasheets, where I honestly think that there's a good chance that Games Workshop's rules writers might well have been inspired by the ease of access of Wahapedia to make one change to their datasheets. In general, in Warhammer 40k codexes, warlord traits are generally listed in their own section in the codex, and that includes special ones for unique characters that generally only get access to one. They don't usually list them on the datasheet. As I mentioned, Wahapedia does tend to include things like that, the warlord trait, points cost, and relevant stratagems and psychic powers below. You can see the warlord trait listed below the unit abilities here on the datasheet. I did find it really quite interesting though that on the last couple of leaked datasheets that came out, say the one for Lord Invocatus of the World Eaters or Azrael for his new model for the Space Marines, both of those seem to have copied Warpedia's style, listing the warlord trait below the unit abilities and above the keywords line. If you compare it to say this one for Ragnar Blackmane from 7th edition, that doesn't list his warlord trait even though he'd be locked to 1. It really does feel that Games Workshop have probably made that decision after seeing Warpedia datasheets and seeing how handy it is to reference a unchanging rule on the same datasheet if it's something that that character might regularly have. Certainly nothing wrong with them doing so in my opinion. If it improves the way that they deliver their rules and gets us clearer datasheets, then I'm all for it. I did just find it kind of fun that as well as developing his own database for Warhammer 40k rules, it seems to have grown to the extent where Games Workshop seem to have reflected some of those changes right back to him. Perhaps imitation is the greatest form of flattery, even if their legal team might have other ideas. So anyway, let me know what you think. What are your guys' experiences with Warhapedia, positive or negative? How do you feel about their unofficial database of 40k rules? And do you think that Games Workshop indeed copied their datasheets? I look forward to hearing your guys' thoughts. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k news coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.